Good afternoon to everybody. The people will come in as Marley allows them in. I would like to thank the Friends of the Business School, our students, MBA students, postgraduate students, colleagues who attend this discussion. Minister Ira Godongwana has read his first medium-term budget policy statement as a member of the Government of National Unity. And I'm not sure if we had different expectations in this budget, but somehow the markets haven't responded as positively as one would expect to this statement by the minister. With me to discuss this is Craig Lemboe. He's from the Stellenbosch Bureau for Economic Research, and Duma Gqubule, sorry for the pronunciation, Research Associate at the Social Policy Initiative, and then our very own Raymond Parsons. Craig, I'm going to start with you. The markets responded negatively to the minister's message yesterday. What did you make of it?
Good afternoon, Piet, and good afternoon to everybody on the call. So we also thought that perhaps there was a missed opportunity with this first MTBPS to give greater policy direction. But like us, the markets are probably expecting too much from an MTBPS. We must remember that we are one of the few countries in the world that allows the sort of midterm review of the broader fiscal status. And often, if there are big proposals and big changes, particularly around taxation, that those are left to the February budget. So I think there was a undue expectation that we would have seen more or could have seen more from this budget. But then in addition to the expectations, there was some deterioration in the expectations of core metrics, particularly a deterioration in the expectation for what the fiscal deficit would look like this year and into next year. And of course, the debt to GDP ratio, which is somewhat higher or peaks somewhat higher than what they had in their February budget. So there are some key data points that disappointed. But I think along with that, it was markets that maybe were expecting too much at this stage of the year.
But Craig, if I can remain with you for a moment, those things that you mentioned, I think those were to be expected. What we didn't expect was that SARS and Kieswetter didn't manage to really collect the taxes that they envisaged in February. That's quite a steep decline of 22 billion rand. And there are more bad news, but I think that is something we couldn't factor in. The rest that you talk about, I think we pretty much expected that, didn't we?
Yeah, just to give you some context as to what we expected as the BR. So our forecast already a month ago was that we're going to see a fiscal deficit of around -5% for this fiscal year, which is what they've eventually announced. And if you look at the tax components, there are specific aspects that underperformed relative to what was expected. VAT underperformed. And part of that is because of the sort of import VAT component was lower because we imported less solar panels this year than what they predicted, or so far this year than what they predicted. And then the other one was on the fuel tax levy. So fuel VAT taxes was somewhat lower as a result of, I think, the reduction of the actual petrol price over the past couple of months. So there were specific factors that played into the weaker VAT uptake. I think there is somewhat of an up surprise in terms of the corporate, so that's a good sign. So corporate profits are improving, and so the corporate taxes rose, but that wasn't enough to offset what we saw in terms of weaker VAT and weaker personal income tax collection.
Duma, I've seen some of the stuff that you've written, and one of the aspects of this budget that a lot of people are concerned about is our debt to GDP. You have a bit of a contrarian view as far as that's concerned. The 75% of GDP doesn't bother you that much.
Yeah.
Sorry, Duma?
Yes, Pete, I just don't understand this obsession with this debt to GDP ratio. The latest IMF fiscal monitor came out, and it shows the average for the world is about 93%. Sorry, I just have to look. The average for the G20 emerging markets, it's about 76%. The average for emerging markets is about 71%. Every single country had an increase in their debt ratio, in the wake of the COVID pandemic. And the IMF is forecasting that the average debt to GDP ratio will increase from 93% this year to 100% by the end of the decade. So we have to remember, what are the objectives of economic policy? The economic policy objectives are to increase average living standards, and an imperfect measure of that is GDP per capita. We have had GDP per capita in 2024 will be lower than it was in 2007. So over 17 years, our GDP per capita has declined. That's the first one. The second one, what is the objective of economic policy? It's to grow the economy. I mean, it's to create employment and achieve full employment. I'm hardcore on this one in terms of the objective should be to create full employment. We currently have a situation where the number of unemployed people is 12.4 million people. It's increased by 6.4 million over the past 15 years. And we have this unviable society with, record levels of unemployment. And, I just want to share some of these. 70.6% for youth, 47% for Africans, 50.4% for African women, 54.2% where your university is in the Northwest. I was recently speaking at Sun City twice recently. 1.1 million unemployed graduates. The people that at your university, many of them will become unemployed. So we have a calamity of a situation. And then the short term, you're talking about the slippage. The short term situation is actually making me scared. The first 2 quarters, we had unemployment increased by 718,000, more than my forecast of 400,000 for the whole year. 71,000 jobs shed. That is worse than my forecast for the whole year of 150,000. Construction sector has shed 118,000 jobs first 2 quarters. That implies that something's happening in the fixed investment space. The budget actually said that construction has got the highest multiplier of all sectors. R1 billion spent on construction creates, I think, it's the highest multiplier for all sectors, and it creates jobs for people who are unemployed and have low levels of skills. 4 consecutive quarters of declining investment. We have had 2 consecutive quarters of declining exports. We had 17 million, such is the level of poverty, that 17 million people applied for the SRD grant, and 56% decline in the registration of embedded generation. So those are the projects at NERSA. 7 ominous signs that things are getting worse this year. And then if I look at all the forecasts as to how it's going to get better, how are we going to get to 1.1% or 1% that's in the budget, I'm a bit skeptical. Pricewaterhouse came up yesterday with 0.8% GDP growth, and most of the forecasts, I think, are based on household consumption expenditure, the two-pot system in the 3rd quarter, disinflation, and things like that. But we have to wait to see. And then the last thing I want to say is that there has been slippage. Treasury has announced they overestimate GDP growth consistently. There was a MTBPS, I think, just before the pandemic, where they showed a graph that they overestimate GDP growth, and that is what causes this slippage. So I think they're overestimating it again. GDP growth of 1.8% a year. You repeat the same failed policies, and you expect a different result. My forecast is 1.5% for the term of this government.
Let me hear this from you. But you say all this in the context of the debt to GDP, which you say we could increase. Is to increase your debt, is that the most efficient, effective way of creating jobs, creating opportunities, creating a more efficient economy?
Yeah, okay, so now, where I start with this one, in 2016, an economist called Niva Makgetla, she brought attention to a surplus that the unemployment insurance fund, which was then above 150 100 billion rands. And she said, why do we need the surplus? Why can't we just invest it in the economy? And before, I sometimes go to NEDLAC and present there. Just after the pandemic started, they couldn't come up with a reason to have the surplus. So they spent 60 billion rand, created it out of thin air to be able to pay 14 million people who were temporarily unemployed. So now we still have, in that kitty, we have 110 billion according to the 2024 budget. So why do we have that unemployment, that UIF surplus? Secondly, there was no need for it before the pandemic. There's no need for it now. And the government has now realized that this surplus can be used to create jobs. I just think they're using it wrongly in terms of this labor market activation program that they announced just before the election. Number two is that the Government Employees Pension Fund has accumulated surpluses until 2023 of about almost 600 billion rands. The funding in this Government Employees Pension Fund is 400 billion above the target that the trustee said. So is there a reason for us to be accumulating surpluses of more than 50 billion rands a year in this government employee? So what I'm trying to say is that one thing we can do, we can restructure a one-off restructuring of the SA Inc. balance sheet, as we did in COVID. And then the second one is that you saw with the, I don't know how to pronounce it, this Gefreka, you know what it's called. The government created 150 billion rands out of thin air in this budget 2024. I spoke to the governor, he explained it to me. They didn't touch the reserves. They created the money for the government. So we in civil society would argue that they spent the money wrongly. It shouldn't have been spent entirely on debt. It should have been plowed back into the economy and increase the GDP growth rate. Because the objective of economic policy is to increase the growth rate. That is what we are focusing on the wrong thing. This obsession with the debt ratio, I think it just disturbs me. And, you know, Keynes lastly, he says, you will never balance the budget through measures which reduce national income. This is 1933. The Chancellor would simply be chasing his own tail. It is the burden of unemployment and the decline in national income which are upsetting the budget. Look after unemployment and the budget will look after itself. That's my view. Yeah.
Professor Parsons, Professor Raymond Parsons, this is a contrarian view. Just give me a piece of your mind on the likeliness of an increase, because it seems like there's expectation that our national debt will grow even higher. Do you argue that we should put a cap on it, a legislative cap on it, and why? And how do you respond to what Duma said? Professor Parsons? Somebody put Professor Parsons' mic on. Mic.
Sorry, I can't put it from my side. There you are. Thank you.
Okay. Go ahead. Yes, Professor Parsons, go ahead.
Well, firstly, good afternoon to everyone. Let me just, before I answer your question directly, let me just once again reinforce the earlier point made that we just need to manage our expectations about the so-called mini budget. It's not a main budget. It's not a complete budget. Look at its title. It's a medium-term statement. Of course, it's used to update us, and I think the minister was very frank. That is why there is a lot of criticism about some of the disappointing figures that are there. But nonetheless, I think it's important to see this event as part of a process which in January, thanks to the GNU, is now going to have a medium-term development plan, which will also have some financial implications, no doubt. And then there's the main budget in February. So what I liked about yesterday was that it applied a reality test to these expectations about the GNU and what it can do and what it can't do, because this is where the rubber hits the road. And so, once again, I would say that the narrative of yesterday was probably more encouraging than some of the numbers. And we must build on that narrative. I think it's quite important as we move through this discussion. Now we come to the issue of how big should a deficit be? Well, as has been indicated, you can look globally, and we should look at that example from a peer point of view. I would just couple the IMF survey of the numbers of where we are in the global setup as far as the deficit is concerned. They coupled it with a warning that yes, you can allow the deficit to rise if it finds its way into investment and not into consumption. And that was an important message of yesterday, which we now seem to be accepting and will need to implement more rigorously. And secondly, you have to also build in what the IMF calls fiscal buffers. You can't just go on increasing the deficit. That would make economics very simple. Unfortunately, it isn't that simple. But the issue now of the anchor, the fiscal anchor, I think it's important that we're having a debate about it. I'm a friendly skeptic in the sense that I think there are too many examples of where an anchor has been set, and then as soon as there's any pressure, it is abandoned. You saw it yesterday with the British Chancellor of the Exchequer. They have an anchor, but she decided, for what appear to be very good reasons, that it needs to be lifted. So you may say, well, that's an argument against it. There may well be concern. I think it's important, therefore, that we get the memorandum, which has been promised for next March, to see whether a fiscal anchor will or will not inject more credibility into our commitments as to where we stand with the deficit and the debt to the GDP ratios. So I think certainly as far as it went yesterday, I thought it was as good and as pragmatic as you could be, given the conflicting priorities. In fact, I even thought the fact that the markets and the EFF were equally disappointed probably tells you there were some good things in the speech yesterday.
Craig, there's something here. The ceiling on the debt that was in South Africa. The suggestion IMF suggests that we legislate it. In other words, it's not possible unless you change the law to go above the ceiling. Maybe Professor Parsons can help me, but was there such a law in Britain? Because the IMF makes it very clear that they want it to be legislated. In other words, politicians can't arbitrarily change it.
In Britain, it's not in the law, but it's in a protocol that was agreed.
Okay, yes, but they suggested.
I think the whole issue, I think there's the principle of, will such an anchor serve a useful purpose? And if so, should it be in the law or not? I am a friendly skeptic. I would like to see the arguments. I think one has been around long enough to say that, frankly, this kind of thing really is very difficult to implement, and you create expectations that there will be discipline that perhaps won't be there. There are other checks and balances which are more important and might be more effective. So I think, once again, one must keep an open mind. I think it's important we debate it. We should debate it because we've been concerned about the debt about the low growth and the high debt now for some years. The late Tito Mboweni warned us about the jaws of the hippo. Well, will an anchor help to close those jaws or not? I think let's have that debate when we've got all the technical arguments on the table.
The minister took this argument to, if I can remain with this for a moment, took this argument to the National Executive Committee and the ANC and was soundly rejected there. Then after that, he still set up a committee and he wants to involve academics, etc., to actually discuss it. I find it curious that the minister has gone against the decision of the National Executive Committee. But Duma, let me just ask you one last question. If the United States of America, with quantitative easing, if they print money, they actually get the economy to grow. If they increase their debt, by the way, they pay around about 4% for their debt. We pay 10% on our debt. We pay 1.2 billion rand a day in debt. Some people argue that it's simply not affordable. How do we spend this money? Because if you argue that government must create the jobs, it's not going to happen. Some people will say it has to come from somewhere else. If we spend this money, how do we spend it to make sure that we don't spend it on state-owned enterprises that are bankrupt? We don't spend it on vanity projects. We don't spend it on cadre deployment. We don't spend it on issues that do not really get the economy to grow. How will you spend that money that you want to borrow how will you spend it to make sure that it actually contributes to economic growth and that it does create employment?
You know, we have to innovate in terms of institutions. There's a credibility. You know, when I talk, Piet, you know, people eventually say, yeah, Duma, I agree with you, but not this ANC government, you know. So we have to innovate in terms of the institutions that we set up during the New Deal. Roosevelt set up what they were called alphabet agencies. These were almost like special purpose vehicles that were set up for a limited period to get the economy growing again. So to illustrate what I'm talking about, Mark Swilling was the one who first made this proposal. We have to have a new community, private sector, government partnerships to a new kind of institution, you know, temporary institutions. I called Gloria Serobe, who ran quite effectively the what you call it, the Solidarity Fund. And I said, why can't we replicate? What can we learn from the Solidarity Fund? It was a private sector initiative, but it was managed. It was a government initiated. I don't know how to call it. Yeah, but you get what I'm saying. So I said, why couldn't we make it, you know, over 9 provinces? Why can't we get contributions towards spending the money in a transparent way that people will understand? So I do agree that we have to innovate in terms of the institutions, the governance of those institutions. But frankly, it's way beyond my pay grade. I talk to my sister a lot about this. She's on the anti-corruption committee, and she's got a different view. And then on the state-owned enterprises, I think it's he said he wouldn't support these state-owned enterprises. We have to understand why they're in that situation. There's no way that we can't provide support to Transnet. I started writing 5 years ago, 6 years ago, that we have to address the Eskom balance sheet. There was no plan. If you go to the 2008 annual report, Bobby Godsell, I don't have his exact words, he says, we have to come up with a plan to finance this build program. And we can't do it through, you know, tariffs alone. And if you look at the Eskom build program, the first few years, it was like insane, like 80% in 1 year, 60% of revenue. It was, and so most of the money. So what I'm trying to say is that they spent 700 billion rands on this build program. It was wasted, but the point is there was no financing of it, and you couldn't do it from what you call it alone, from tariffs alone. Now, tariffs have reached a pain point. South Africans can't afford these tariffs. They will have to now give subsidies, and they will have to provide subsidies towards electricity prices. Now, Transnet, because these are the two that matter, 130 billion rand debt, they pay 1 billion rands a month on interest. There is no solution to the Transnet issue without addressing their balance sheet problem. And if you think they can, you know, trade their way to reduce that 130 billion. As I said, for Eskom can't trade their way out of that debt problem that they've accumulated. The same applies to Eskom. Now that Eskom has got some kind of relief, they're investing in the maintenance, as the chairman said, and it's making a big difference. We need to create a similar situation for Eskom, for Transnet as well. And I can guarantee you that it will happen, Piet. And they keep kicking this can down the road. There is no solution. As the chairman of Andile Sango has said, they need some debt relief at Transnet. I'm adamant that we need. So we made, sorry, last thing I said, there's this assumption that Eskom, Transnet, SANRAL, those are the 3 major ones, and local governments can trade their way, you know, can finance the huge infrastructure requirements that we need as a country. And I think it's a wrong assumption. Yeah.
Okay, but I've spoken to some mining executives recently, Craig, and some of them told me that we mine here and we want to export through Richards Bay. We cannot get permission from Transnet or for anybody to actually manage, maintain, and run a railway line to Richards Bay. We can do it. We will want to do it. We can increase our exports. We can create more jobs. We can sink more shafts. We can do a lot of things if we can get the logistics. But we do not get the logistics, the permission. The minister yesterday alluded to that too. He said that he expects these institutions, Transnet and Eskom, he expects them to go into public-private partnerships in an effort to address their issues. Is privatization on the cards for this, Craig?
I think we should steer away from the word privatization per se, but greater private involvement.
Why
Well,
is that a swear word?
no, not privatization. Well, privatization entails the sort of wholly usurping of that institution. I do believe that greater private sector involvement would be appropriate, but there are still sort of national strategic roles that these institutions can play. Not all of them, but in many instances, there needs to be a marriage between, or a greater proportion of private sector involvement in trying to get these institutions. But when we say privatization, it's sort of a company comes in, buys Transnet, it's now a private company. So that's not the sort of goal that the government themselves are putting forward. But I agree with you that when we talk about infrastructure and we talk about the need for infrastructure, that increasingly the private sector is going to be called on to assist. The model that will define that assistance is still being developed and hopefully will be ready by the February budget. But if we take examples abroad, it can include things such as concessions. It could include things such as paying for the investment and then getting opportunity to manage it as well. We have had some good examples of sort of private sector partnerships for infrastructure working in the local context. Gautrain, I think is probably the best example of that particular model, where the private sector and the public sector worked hand in hand in order to get things off the ground. Another important example is in terms of renewable energy, where we saw that it was merely just some changes in the regulation that allowed greater private sector build programs and private sector investment in renewable energy to sort of augment the energy supplied by Eskom. So Eskom still needs to exist. We still need to supply energy to rural and poor communities and sort of base load energy. But where firms can supply their own energy, where households can supply their own energy in the context of load shedding, that was a sort of appropriate move. So it's not large-scale changes that are necessarily needed, or ideological shifts that are needed. It can be something as simple as shifting some regulatory hurdles to allow a willing private sector to invest in infrastructure, which would ultimately be to the benefit of the broader society.
But Professor Parsons, the president has been talking about this since his first inauguration, and we're still talking about creating the space for public-private partnerships and removing red tape. In other words, the conditions under which the state and private sector can work in balance, it just don't seem to come about. What is your take on that?
Peter, I think the one point one would want to make, by the way, might I suggest a more neutral word, denationalization, might be a better word, which will make more people happy and less upset by other more ideological words. But having said that, I want to come back to the issue of investment, because that was an important point made by the president through his investment conferences, of course. But I think what came through to me yesterday was that there's no other place to hide now if you don't accommodate creating an environment which will now boost investment and the infrastructure you need to go with it. I just want to remind us that the challenge is that in terms of our economic planning, you need 25 to 30% fixed investment, that is public and private, in order to get your 3, 4, 5% growth rates that everyone aspires to. The fact is we're on 14.9. No wonder the minister is worried and realizes that, yes, what does the Reserve Bank tell us in the last week or so? This 1% growth that we're expecting this year, the heavy lifting is being done by consumption. And we need to get a better balance, not only in the economy, but in our public finances. And that was the clear message that, in fact, came through yesterday. That means that when you look at the role of certain key state entities, they have got to, whether you call it restructuring, denationalization, but they have got to serve the economic interests of the country a lot better. And the conditions that have been imposed on some of them in order to get relief must be enforced. And I got the message yesterday that there is some more evidence of tough love there. that will be exercised. Because at the end of the day, you don't get that 15% up to 20 or 25. And if you look at the global surveys, other emerging markets are roughly doing much better than us in terms of growth, supported by fixed investment of between 20 and 25%. So we don't have to aim for 25 to 30, but if we can get up to 20, and the important issue then from yesterday is to implement what the commitments are yesterday on the infrastructural and investment side. That, because the message of yesterday was, if there isn't investment-led growth, you will not even get your 1.5 or 1.8. I mean, yeah, we argue about decimal points. I mean, that's what's we've been reduced to. Some will say 1.6. No, it's 1.8. Or no, maybe it's 1.5. We've got to break through that low growth trap, and we've got to ensure that where you use the instrument of the public-private sector partnerships, under whatever name it sails, make them more effective and ensure that they deliver what the economy needs and help to address those wider social ends that go beyond the technicalities that we get absorbed with when we talk about monetary policy or about fiscal policy.
Duma, the minister met you halfway yesterday. He said he's going to apply tough love, but he didn't tell us how to resolve the issues, except for making or alluding to public-private partnerships. You're talking about their balance sheets. The minister said nothing about that.
Okay, Pete, I've been looking at budgets for many years. And if you go back 20 years, whatever, pick a random year, 2004, and then pick one now. If you look at public-private partnerships, it's 2% of total this year, 2% of total public sector investment. This year, it's about, I went to check quickly, 6.9 billion versus 300 billion. Yeah. Hello?
That's nothing.
That's nothing, yeah. So, and then the second thing I want to say is that I used to work at the Department of Transport as an advisor more than 10 years ago. They were talking concessions then. Why should I believe that there will ever be a concession during the period of this government of national unity? I was looking for the chief director of rail, Mawetu, who I used to work with at the Department of Transport. I couldn't find him. So I just say that my problem is the government. What I read in the budget, they talk about blended finance, but they don't want to put a cent into the blender. So they want a situation whereby everything 100% comes from, the private sector. And that is completely unrealistic. So I'm a hardcore, unapologetic Keynesian. Investment follows GDP growth. Everything else is noise. You can't create investment from just vibes, from sentiment, from faith, from prayer. So the government's policy to create investment from that 15%, it's based on intangibles that we can't measure, that will not, we've been sitting at this 15%. Yeah, so if the government is not investing in its people and its infrastructure, and the last thing I want to say, which we talked about earlier, is that I'm opposed to these fiscal rules, but there was a one, I think in the UK under Gordon Brown, and I'm not sure Rachel wanted to introduce it now. I don't know you protect investment from the debt calculation. Yeah. So you have to protect public investment. And there's something called a golden rule, whereby the calculation of the debt ratio excludes infrastructure. Because you don't have to be an economist to know that what the government has done to cut public investment by 25% since 2009 makes no sense whatsoever. Public investment has got huge multipliers. It creates jobs. It creates the resources to more than pay for itself. So no, the government can't expect it. They're looking for a free lunch whereby everything happens by the private sector. They end up financializing everything. So I was asking, where my father's family lives in Kariga, KwaNobuhle Township, do you want to financialize everything? The schools, the hospitals, the fire station? No, it can't work like that. The government cannot absolve itself from its responsibility to invest in its own people. And you can't have this free lunch where investment magically appears because of prayers. Like, you know, people go and pray for rain. So what the government is doing is like praying for investment. No, yeah.
Craig, the president.
I can just come in very quickly on this point, because I think we're tending to make a very static analysis here. We have a government of national unity with its strengths and its weaknesses. Part of what was happening yesterday was to set the future agenda for the GNU government. In particular, I referred very specifically to the medium-term development plan, which is due in January, and then the main budget, of course, which will give us a more complete story in February. The point about what we need to ask ourselves, what is it yesterday that the GNU must now put on their agenda, their unfinished business, which is quite a large agenda still? What is it that you take from yesterday and say, given what was said yesterday, given the reality tests that we faced yesterday, what is the unfinished business that you expect a government of national unity in South Africa to now implement? Because if they do not implement it, then all the targets we've been talking about will not be achieved, and there will be recriminations. So it's in the interest of the GNU to tackle what emerges from yesterday in their future decision-making. And that has got to be put at their door in order to create that environment that the Minister of Finance wants, and in order to ensure that we jack up our 15% ratio of fixed investment to GDP to a level where we should unlock our potential and do what we want to do. And if we don't do that, there will be recriminations. I made the point in an article, fortunately or unfortunately, there are political events are pending. I hope that concentrates the mind wonderfully.
Craig, I hear Professor Parsons, and I've heard the argument before, and I don't think it's a bad argument, but why did I get the impression yesterday the Minister of Finance couldn't care less about the government of national unity? He was trying to swim in very difficult waters. It's almost as if he functioned independent from the government of national unity. He literally ignored the National Executive Committee of the ANC. He put the facts and figures on the table and say, these are difficult times. If I understand Duma correctly, he says, you need to spend more. You have to invest. If you listen to Gonogwana, he says, I don't have the money and I will not borrow. In other words, the government is out of money. They cannot contribute meaningfully to investing in the people of South Africa.
I actually have a different view. I think Enoch is thriving in this GNU environment. I think the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Finance before him were dead set on these economic reforms, and these economic reforms included somewhat more private sector participation than what the EFF and what the ANC or members in the ANC would have liked. And there was much more of a struggle to maintain fiscal responsibility in the sixth administration than what there is now. I think there's much more buy-in, given the diverse views within the GNU around fiscal responsibility and around particularly the implementation of these key structural reforms, which is their agenda to promote growth. You're quite right, Piet. I think we have reached the threshold where the fiscus cannot be the main driver of economic growth and revert to their role as being an enabler of economic growth coming through and job creation coming through from other sectors of the economy.
That other sector is the private sector. That's
yes,
the
private sector. So I think,
but Duma will tell you that's not possible. The private sector will not do it on their own.
So I think you alluded to it earlier, Piet, already with your mining anecdote. They want to do it. They've got the money to do it. They just need to be allowed to do it and it be done in a way that isn't to the detriment of society. So that's where we need to sort of strike the balance. So that's where government still has a role to play. But I want to touch on the fiscal debt component quite briefly. I mean, South Africa not too long ago did very well on these fiscal metrics. During the time of Trevor Manuel, we had a very low debt to GDP ratio. We were running a fiscal surplus. And the reason why we really saw these metrics balloon is, one, the great financial crisis, where the government played a big role in stabilizing the economy, moving counter-cyclically, and again, post-COVID or during COVID and post-COVID with the injections in the economy that we've seen there. And that is the important fiscal buffer role that Professor Parsons also alluded to. And you only realize you need a fiscal buffer, or we don't want to get into a position where these metrics are out of kilter and realize we needed a fiscal buffer. And then having to move to extreme policies in order to correct some of the wrongs in the past. And there are very good examples of these, Argentina being probably the prime example, where they've run fiscal deficits for years. Their debt to GDP ratio is hopelessly out of kilter, and now they're sitting with an austerity budget. We're sitting with a consolidatory budget, which is still sort of neutral for economic growth. It's not an austere budget, and we don't want to end up in the position where we need to go to the extremes. We must bear in mind that the fiscal policy and the fiscal space has tremendous intergenerational aspects. We don't want to go into debt now for our grandchildren to have to pay off when they start paying taxes and when they start working. So there's a fine balance that needs to be struck around this budget. But along the issue of Enoch's role in the GNU, I think is thriving.
Duma, there's another elephant in the room, a nasty one. The minister made money available to get rid of civil servants. In South Africa, 35% of everything that we have in the budget, 35% goes to 1.3 million people. That can't be sustainable. What is your view on the minister trying to get rid of 30,000 government workers to lower, instead of a decrease or limiting the annual increases, which is exceptional, he tries to reduce to increase unemployment to some extent.
Yes. Okay. So in a previous life, I used to advise COSATU. I was at the wage talks with the National Treasury, advising COSATU on this thing. Now, if you take away all the noise, all that has happened to this public sector wage bill is that there was the occupation OSD, where they tried to improve the salaries of skilled people. Occupation-specific dispensation. These are your doctors, your nurses, your skilled people in the public sector. So I think that was until early 2010s. I can't remember. So it increased. Since then, as a percentage of GDP, it has declined. In the last budget, I think it's 32%. So the problem is the wage bill is a function of, it's measured as a percentage of GDP. All these metrics that people focus on, if you grow the economy, then you can afford to have more public servants. So if during the period when we were growing by about 4.5% a year from 2003 to 2008, we increased the number of public servants by more than 200, I can't remember, 200, 300,000, but the wage bill as a percentage of GDP declined despite the fact that we increased the number of public servants. Now back to currently, he talks about 55,000 people who earn more than R1 million. I remember when I was working for COSATU, many of those people are doctors. They earn more than R1 million. These are highly skilled people. We have got huge shortage of doctors. If you benchmark against OECD standards, doctor population ratio, we need another 150,000. If you benchmark nurses against OECD benchmarks, we need 300,000 nurses. So what I'm trying to say, it is not true. And then there's a table I saw quickly there. The ratio of public servants to the population has grown since 1994. I can't remember what the number is, significantly. So each public servant is responsible for more people. So the sort of the public service has kind of been static while the population's increased by whatever, 50%. That's number one. Number two, the infrastructure has not kept up with the increase in the population. So we need to have more public servants who are skilled, doctors, nurses, judges, all those people. So if we have to have this national health insurance, I was arguing with the Department of Health, they believe that you can kind of create it by rejigging the current budget. But I said, no, you can't. Yeah, we must rejig the current budget, but we need to have more doctors, we need to have more nurses, we need to have more pharmacists, we need to have more radiologists, we need to have more skilled people. And if you look at the Department of Health budget, 60% of them are highly skilled people, you know, people who don't push paper. So yes, we must get rid of the bureaucrats, the paper pushers, but we can't compromise on the teachers at the public schools, the nurses, the frontline workers. So my thing, so we can afford, if the economy grows, to, you know, if we, so you know what, Pete, last thing, if you had to put, I'm against single solutions to multiple problems, because we have to grow by 4% just to create jobs for the 700,000 people who are going to enter the labor market every year until 2035. But I'm against single solutions to multiple overlapping crises. But if you have to put a gun to my head, I said, what is the number one thing? You know, I was with Bruce Whitfield. He was at a presentation 2 days ago at the Harambee, and he's asked people for his new book, what is the one thing that will change South Africa, you know, get our country, you know, working again? And different people said different things. Mine, if you put a gun to my head, invest infrastructure, protect infrastructure, increase infrastructure investment by the government and the public sector, everything else will take care for itself. Let's stop focusing on the silly debt ratio. If the government invests in its infrastructure, as it did between 2003 and 2008, when public investment was increasing by 14% a year, then everything else takes care of itself. And the last thing I want to say is that a national budget doesn't operate like a household budget or a company income statement. When the government spends on its people and its infrastructure, the economy grows. When the government stops spending on its people and infrastructure, as has happened over the past 15 years, we're going to end up where we are now. So the high debt ratio is a symptom of the lack of investment in the people and the infrastructure. Yeah.
Pete, if I may.
Yes, please.
If I may just jump in on this question around the money available for laying off workers. I think there's a bit of a misconstrued implication thereof. The minister specifically said for early retirement. He didn't specify that it was for the essential services such as teachers and nurses and doctors. So we shouldn't jump and get ahead of ourselves and say, well, this is 30,000 less doctors. These are people who are close to retiring anyway, who will be given a financial incentive to step aside earlier. These are staff that are more expensive than if they were to be replaced by younger staff that come in at a little less cost. So we can still rehire the 30,000, for example, but they wouldn't cost R1 million a year. They'd cost 400,000 rand a year. So it's subtle ways in which we're trying to reduce our public wage bill, but it's not to say that we are going to slash doctors and nurses. It was very specific around it being for early retirement, and it's understandable these are expensive staff members that can potentially be replaced by younger, also capable, but somewhat less costly labor.
Okay, if I could just come in quickly, just to add to that, to what has been said. I think what the global research about South Africa has shown in recent years is that, firstly, our total public sector is not out of line with other comparable countries in terms of its size. The problem is the wage bill. And if you shift attention away from the wage bill, you are going to make mistakes. For example, already, although we all talk very loosely about, yes, we need fiscal consolidation, we need to stabilize the debt to GDP ratio. Behind it, what is happening, because you're not prioritizing properly, you're not just cutting fat, you're now cutting muscle. And that's a risk you've got to face.
But Professor Parsons,
you have to now prioritize in such a way that you do get a better balance between consumption and investment in your public finances. Because one of the unintended consequences is that you begin to cut muscle and not cut fat.
But let me just, this is the last point I want to hear from you. Davy Rood says that if you work for government, you get 35% more than for an equivalent position in the private sector. And if you work for a state-owned enterprise, it's 45% more. Are these people overpaid? Professor Parsons, let me start with you. Are they overpaid? Is that what you say?
That's the point I'm making. I'm saying that the message of global research is we're overpaying the public sector That's why the wage bill dominates, which is why yesterday, again, the minister said that is one of the elevated risks to our public finances. And we need to manage that. Of course, there have to be increases. The question is, you can't have 12%, for example, which is on the table. Not that that's going to happen, but the fact remains that you're right. The research shows the wage bill is too high, which means there are components in the public sector that are being overpaid.
Duma, give me your mind on this one. Are they overpaid, the public sector?
Okay, so sorry, I lost. I just want to say one thing, is that this is not the first time this was done. When I was working for COSATU, just before the pandemic, they made the same offer and people didn't accept. There was low take-up of this offer. So I think it's a cosmetic thing that sounds great in principle, but it's not going to achieve, even if we get rid of 30,000, get younger people, it's not going to solve the core issue about public sector performance, you know. So we need and I just don't have this, you know, when you look at the Department of Health HRD strategy, you see the level of skills that these people have. I mean, your doctors, your pharmacists, your whatever, and these are highly skilled people. And the average skill level in the public sector is more, let's forget about the paper pushers, but the average skill level in the public sector, as Treasury said in one of their compensation reports, is almost this, it's higher than what you find in the private sector. So yeah, so I just think that this is a cosmetic thing that will not make, and everybody knows it's not going to make a difference. People, and they're going to retire when they want to retire. And let's be honest, yeah. And last time they did it, just before the pandemic, Treasury said, if you remember, very few people took it up. So it's another cosmetic, gimmicky thing.
I want Craig to end this off, but I want to see if I can push you into a corner. I want a yes or a no from you. The civil service, are they overpaid?
Some of them are, obviously, but you know, have you been seeing on social media all these payments? Yeah, no, they're not. I think overall they're not being some are overpaid, the bureaucrats, but the skilled ones, they're not being overpaid. Yeah.
Craig, you have the last word here.
I think, yeah, I think there's an element of, I think they are being paid too much for the level of productivity. We cannot have such a high public wage bill and still so many people complaining about service delivery. And we cannot have such a high salary bill at Eskom, and for 2 years we already had electricity. So it is, if they're able to match their productivity with a salary increase, if they get at 12% and they increase their productivity and service delivery by 12% and 15%, then it's warranted. But they just haven't been able to do that.
But the minister don't talk about it being warranted. He says we can't afford it.
Yes, no. Yeah,
we simply can't. They can work 10 times harder. They can produce better services. We can't afford that's what he says. The expectation is in any case for them to deliver better, the productivity to be higher. And still, even if they work at the maximum, we still can't afford it, as he says.
Can I just make one point? If you look at the doctor in the public sector, I can't remember, to patient ratios, it's 1 to 2,500. That is insane. So what kind of productivity are we? And then if you look at these ratios, it's like insane. Like teacher, learner, educator, the regions where it's like above 50 in rural areas. So how do you measure productivity in that situation?
Yeah, that for doctors and teachers, as I mentioned, those are specific essential services, specific cases. I'm talking about the clerk at Home Affairs.
Yeah.
That is the sort of dead wood, not a specific clerk. I don't have any specific person in mind. And I know Home Affairs is making big strides in improving themselves. But there are many pockets of service delivery in the state that are woefully poor. I can concur with you that our teachers and our doctors and our nurses are of the best in the world. We need more of them. But because we have too many of these others, you know, we cannot strike a good enough balance.
Okay,
but they are unaffordable, yeah.
I'm going to cut this part of the conversation when I send it off to COSATU a little later on. But thank you very, very much. This has been our last picture for the year. Duma, I can't believe I only discovered you now. Lovely mind. Thanks a lot for your participation and your involvement. Craig, you will be on my hit list again if I present this program. And then our very own Professor Raymond Parsons, always the wise guy around. Thank you very, very, very much, the three of you. Much appreciated. And if there are any programs like this Pitsos in the future, we will negotiate and we will communicate with you in the future. But thank you very, very much for making time and being available to the Northwest University Business School today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Piet. Thank you, Duma.
Thank you so much.
Bye.